Okay, so welcome back to the NIH Library's Bibliometric Training Series. My name is Chris Belter. So today we are again going to be picking up where we left off the last session. So in the last session we talked about actually creating a network visualization using Gephi, saving it out to a variety of file types, and in particular that SVG file format that I mentioned last time. So this time we're going to pick up from that SVG file and talk about how to work with it in Inkscape to get it into a final format that we can actually put into a report, feel good about, and so forth. So to do some of that work, we're going to be using an open source tool called Inkscape. So this is another one of those open source software tools. It's free to download, that we use quite a lot in a variety of tasks, particularly for cleaning up network visualizations, but we'll also run other types of visualizations through it just to sort of put final tweaks on it. We can also use it to create infographics from graphics that were created in some of these other tools, so we can add in some of that additional context to make it sort of interpretable as a standalone thing, all kinds of things like that. So again, it is a free resource available just from inkscape.org. There is a huge user group and a huge user community around Inkscape. This is much more widely used than any of the other tools that we've talked about in this session so far. So there's a huge amount of documentation and community resources available for using this thing. There's a great amount of resources available directly from the inkscape.org website. But also, again, if you do some Googling, there are very active user groups, forums, YouTube videos, tons and tons of documentation for how to use this thing. It is a very, very widely used tool. And again, there are a lot of people who are very helpful about answering questions and documenting how to do things. So definitely look around online for some of those things. You can think of Inkscape as the open source and free version of Adobe Illustrator. So if you're familiar with the Adobe Illustrator, it's a product that allows you to do a lot of these kinds of vector graphic editing, but it's unlike Adobe Illustrator. Inkscape is free, and Illustrator costs several $100s to actually download and obtain access to. So this is definitely has an advantage over that in that it's free and it has nearly all of the functionality that Adobe Illustrator does. So it's a really great tool. So that's what we're going to be using in the course today. However, before we actually get into that live demo piece, I wanted to do a quick sidebar about image types and file types, because what we're going to be working with in Inkscape is working with a very particular kind of image files called vector files. And so I want to sort of briefly explain what the difference is between those files and files that you might be familiar with, so you've got a better idea of what we can actually do in Inkscape versus something like Photoshop, because those are very, very different things. So within image files, a lot of the image files that you're probably used to seeing are files like JPEG, TIFF, PNG, these types of files. These are what are called bitmap files, or they're also sometimes referred to as raster images. So essentially what these bitmap or raster files are a series of colored dots. So the image is actually represented as a series of dots within that map in order to display an image. So that's where the bitmap comes from. It's literally a map of bits. The advantage to this approach is that when you're zoomed out quite a lot, the human eye can't distinguish between individual dots, and so it sort of blurs those dots together in order to create an image from those dots. So rather than storing the image directly, it stores it as a series of dots, where the human eye then sort of blends together in order to make an image. So when you're looking at an image from far away, like we're seeing here, it looks great because the human eye is sort of blending all of those dots together. The other advantage to this approach is it makes it a much smaller file size to actually be able to store this. So if you were storing an actual image, you would have hundreds of megabytes in a single image, and that would be very inefficient for storage, retrieval, and so forth. So by storing things as a series of dots, it actually reduces the file size considerably without really any loss of fidelity when we're looking at the overall image. The problem with this file type is when we start trying to zoom in on the actual image. And so when we zoom in, it starts to get pixelated, it starts to get fuzzy, because you start to actually see those colored dots. So that pixelation is actually you seeing the dots that are being represented in that image. So that's why it becomes pixelated. So in some of these very high information heavy or information dense images, sometimes this is not the best approach. The other disadvantage to this is if you want to change things within the image, you literally have to recolor the dots or say over top of those colored dots to change a color or change a label, things like that. It doesn't give you nearly as much flexibility. So once the image is sort of stored, it's kind of set in stone. Photoshop allows you to sort of tweak that a little bit, but again, it's using sort of, it's painting over the dots that are already there rather than changing the image itself. What we're going to be talking about today are vector graphic files. And so vector graphics are file types like SVG, EPS, and in some cases PDF. PDF is a little bit of a special case because it can actually have either vector graphics or raster graphics, but some types that were actually created in PDF can also be vector graphic files. So with these vector graphics, the image is actually stored as a set of instructions for how to render an image. So behind a file like an SVG file is actually an XML file that says, draw a circle, make it this size, place it here, and give it this color. Then draw another circle, place it here, give it this color, make it this size, so on and so on and so forth. So it's literally a set of instructions for how to actually render an image. This has a number of advantages, particularly with these very rich information-heavy types of documents. Again, when you're zoomed out, it looks very, very similar, but when you zoom in on a set of instructions, it will never pixelate because there are no pixels. It will never actually get fuzzy because that's not the way that the image is stored. It will never actually get pixelated no matter how far you zoom in. So that's one advantage. The other advantage is you can click directly into one of those dots and change the color because, again, it's just a series of instructions. So in the XML file, you just change the color, it automatically changes it to that one thing, and you have that control. So you literally have control over everything in a particular image. So again, that's one of the major advantages when we're trying to create and sort of polish images created in other file formats, because it's stored as this series of instructions, and it's stored in a way that we can access all of those things, change anything that we want to, do whatever we want to the image before we save it into something like a PDF or a PNG or a bitmap that would actually go into a report. So this is why we usually use this vector image file format first, and then sort of export a bitmap after we're done cleaning it up in this vector image file format. I will also note that a lot of journals will also prefer these .eps files for submission because, again, the resolution doesn't matter. Because so you can size it however you want, and again, it's a set of instructions, so it will never get a low resolution file, it will never pixelate or anything like that. So you can get the same amount of fidelity without the very, very large file sizes of, a 200 megabyte TIFF image. You get the same amount of resolution in maybe 4 or 5 megabytes, or if that, with this .eps file. So a lot of the journals will prefer them because they have that very high resolution file format and they can resize it however they want to, whereas with a TIFF image, you're sort of limited in that approach. So this Inkscape is one of those tools that's designed for working with these kinds of files. So that's what we're going to be working with today, and that's what we're working with from that Gephi export. So let's go ahead and jump over into the live demo just to see what this looks like. So in my set of files, I have a series of file types. And again, I can sort of show you what some of these look like if we, so I've saved the individual co-authorship network as a PDF, a PNG, and an SVG file format, just again to sort of show some of the differences between these file types. Again, if I open up this PDF, and so because this PDF was created by Gephi, the image that's stored in here is a vector graphic rather than a bitmap image. So if I just zoom in as far as I want to, it will never pixelate. So you can get as far in as you want. You know, I'm at 600%. I can zoom even further in. So I can zoom in as far as I want to, and it will never actually get distorted or pixelated. So very useful file format. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up this co-authorship network, the .svg file that we saved from Gephi, and we're going to open it directly in Inkscape. If you've got Inkscape installed, it should default directly to open up with Inkscape, or you can just right-click on it and hover over Open With, and you should be able to get to Inkscape. But I'm going to just open it with Inkscape and go ahead and get started with some of the polishing. Inkscape does sometimes take a while to actually open up, so just be patient and it will eventually appear and you'll be able to start working with it. So let me go ahead and maximize this so we get a sense for what Inkscape looks like. Your version of Inkscape may look a little bit different than what you're seeing here. You probably don't have some of these panes over here on the right. I'll get to those in a little bit. So let me quickly walk you through what you're looking at here in the Inkscape interface. There are a number of menus here at the top that have a number of tools and algorithms available to you. I don't use them very often though, because most of the time the things that I'm interested in are represented elsewhere. So a lot of the tools that I actually use are arranged here on the right. So the vast majority of what I do in Inkscape is contained in each one of these buttons here at Tools on the left. The toolbar at the top actually allows you to sort of modify the behavior of any one of these tools. So if I change to the magnifying glass, for instance, you can see there are options for tweaking the zoom tool. Or if I change it to the circle tool, it will again change to different attributes for controlling the behavior of that particular tool. So again, this is just sort of ways to customize any one of these particular tools to work with a drawing that's here in the center. So the center is obviously what your document looks like. The border around it shows you where the file type is or the page size is. And you also have some rulers around the side just for scaling and orientation purposes. On the right are some of the options that you may or may not have opened in previous sessions. So the two dialog boxes that I use all the time are the export PNG image and then the fill and stroke box. And I'll come back to both of those a little bit later on when we actually get to those. Further to the right are some additional options for text and some other tools. There are also a series of options for what's called snapping. And so this is to allow you to arrange things and sort of snap individual elements of the drawing to a page grid. So you can create a page grid and sort of align things to that grid to make sure that everything is aligned properly. So you can align things to corners, you can align objects to their centers, you can align cusp nodes, align text anchors, all kinds of things like that. So there's a variety of these options available, and so I'll use a number of those when we're actually going through to create the legend to make it aligned properly and sized and all of that stuff properly aligned in the actual graphic. There's some other things down at the bottom and again in some of these file menus. I'm not going to talk about them in a whole lot of detail, but I just wanted to at least point out there's a lot more that's available here. So a couple of things that we want to do when we get started. This is, as I mentioned, this is the actual page that we're going to be working with. And so this is all of the individual graphics that are represented within that page. So a couple of things that I'm going to do first is to set up this page. So I'm going to go over here to the magnifying glass. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit. So I'm going to click on the zoom in, or you can just click directly on it to zoom to a particular place. So I'm just going to zoom in a little bit just to get the view to where I can actually see the whole image. I'm going to go back over here to the selection tool, and now I'm going to change some of the document properties. So you can see that there's not a lot of spacing between the edge of the page and the actual drawing. There's some other things like that that we want to just sort of tweak a little bit just to give it a little bit of white space around the image. Some other things that we'll do with the actual page size. So to do all of that, we're going to go up to File, and then we're going to go to Document Properties. That Document Properties is going to bring up a dialog box that allows you to do a lot of things within the actual document itself. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to change the page size. So instead of this custom size, we're going to maybe make it a little bit larger. So instead of 2498, maybe we'll do 2600. Your size will obviously be different depending on what image you're working with, but I'm just going to give myself a little bit of padding and then maybe recrop it a little bit later on. So we'll set the width to 2600. Maybe I'll set the height to 1800. And again, sometimes it can take a minute for some of these width and height adjustments to actually go through. So we'll just do that, and then we'll change height to 1800. And again, I'm working in pixels here, but you could change this to inches, you could change it to millimeters, other things that they are available. I just tend to prefer to work in pixels. So that's going to change the page size a little bit. And then the final thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to change the background color. So right now, the background color is this sort of checkbox, which means it's a clear background. If you try and export a PNG image with a transparent background, it can sometimes cause problems in Word documents or PowerPoint documents. So you want to remember to change this background to a flat white rather than being transparent to just avoid some of those problems. So I'm just going to click on the background color. And that's again going to bring up a little dialog box where if I wanted to change the color, I could. But you can also change this A value, which is actually the transparency. So I'm going to set that instead of 0. I'm going to change that to 255. And then I'm going to click Close. And so that's going to change it to just a flat white background color rather than that transparent color. It doesn't look very different, but when you actually go to export it, it makes a difference. So it's worth remembering to do. So now that I've made some of those adjustments, I can go ahead and close the Document Properties tab, and then I'm going to go ahead and save this as a different file format. I don't want to save over the original SVG file format or the original SVG document, just in case I need to go back and make any additional changes, or if I do something wrong to this working version, I can always go back to the original and start over again. So I'm going to save this by going up to File, and then Save. Oh, I just saved over the current version, so I'm actually going to do File Save As. That's all right. And then I'm just going to call this co-author edited. You can call it whatever else you wanted to, but this is just my naming convention. So I'll call it as this edited version and save it that way. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to just tweak where the image actually is to just give ourselves a little bit of buffer room around the page borders. So I'm going to select the selection tool up here in the upper left, and then I'm going to click, hold, and then drag to select the entire image. So you can select pieces of the image, or you can select the entire thing by doing that click, hold, and drag option. So I'm going to do that. And so I've selected 3 different layers here. So within this graphic, the graphic is actually stored as 3 images that are all overlapping one another. One of them is the labels, so the actual names of the people in the co-authorship network. The second layer is the actual dots that are represented here, and then the third layer are all of the lines. So you can theoretically work with any one of those different layers to adjust things accordingly, but for this purposes, I want to get all 3, so I just use the click and drag option to select all 3 of them, and then we can adjust it from there. So to actually do the adjusting, you can click in and hold and drag if you wanted to, but most of the time what I do is actually go up here to the toolbar, and I'll make some of the position adjustments within the toolbar. So within the selection tool, you've got X and Y coordinates for the position of the actual set of things that you have selected. So what I'll usually do is I'll just come in here to the X value, change it to 10, and that will just bump the entire image over so that there's 10 pixels of space between the page border and the start of the actual set of images. We actually increase that to 20 just to give it a little bit more space. Yeah, that looks good. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the Y coordinates. So again, I'm going to change those Y coordinates to 20, click out, and it will then just sort of nudge the actual image into a nice orientation and layout where we actually want it. There's some other things. You can change the size of the entire thing. So if you wanted to scale it up or down, you can actually use some of these arrows to change the size. I don't do this very often. I just tend to prefer to keep the size as is and then just change the size of the bitmap image, but you could do that if you wanted to. You could also rotate the whole thing. You could work with the layers and all kinds of other things like that in here. But for this purposes, we're good to go for here. So I'm going to click out of it to unselect all of those things. So now we've got a little bit of a page border around the graphic. This is looking a little bit better. The next thing that we want to do is we want to add a legend to this so that we can say how large a particular node size is, what that represents in terms of the number of publications, what the individual lines mean, all of those kinds of things. So there are a couple of different ways to do this depending on how you want to work. I'm going to again just show you the way that I typically do this, and then you can feel free to explore with other options that may seem to make sense to you. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit more, just to kind of, actually, let's actually stay out here for now. And then I'm going to go over into my files, and I'm going to open both the edge lists and the node lists that I saved from Gephi. So remember, as I said, in order to actually have the size options, you need both the node table and the edge table in order to get the corresponding numbers of publications, co-authorships, all of that stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and open those up. So I've got my author edge list and I've got my node list. So I'm going to start with the node list because I'm going to start with adding a legend based on the number of publications by each author. So I'm going to open that up, and then I'm going to sort this just by the number of authored works. So I've got a sense for who has the most publications and so on. So I'll just sort that, largest to smallest. So I know this, the Boud C has the most authored works with 95. So that's going to be the largest circle that's going to be in my legend. So I can now go in here and find that particular person. I can either copy this circle directly, or what I typically tend to do is I just draw some additional circles on top of this that correspond to the right sizes. So I'm going to get the sizes right, I'm going to turn the page grid on. So to do that, I'm going to go to View, and then Page Grid. And so now we've got this nice grid that we can work with to get the sizes right. We can align things to this grid to make sure everything's aligned properly, do all of those kinds of things. So going to zoom in just once and get a sense for, this looks like this particular node is about 5 squares tall. So that's what I'm going to shoot for when I'm actually creating these circles. So I'm going to go over here to the left and click on the Circle tab. And so I'm just going to draw a circle just to see what it looks like and just kind of get some of the settings down before I actually create the real thing. Because whenever you work with this tool, it's going to default to whatever the values were in your previous setting. So that's not necessarily what you wanted to use in the current version. So I just sort of get a circle out there so that I can start adjusting it and tweaking it to how I want it in this particular session. So right now, you can see it's got this red fill. In my fill and stroke is where I'm going to change some of the settings for that. So to get there, you would go up to Object and select this Fill and Stroke dialog box. And that will bring up that Fill and Stroke box so that you can actually work with it in the lower right. So just select that, make sure it's selected, and then you can go in here and you can change options for both the fill and then the border, what we're called the stroke. So you can select that and make adjustments from there. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the actual outline. If you click in, I don't actually have any outline currently set. That's what that X means. So I'm going to go over here to just select a flat color. And that's going to give it a flat outline color. And then I can change the actual color to that. I'm going to select maybe 192. You can change the red, green, blue values to change the color. So I'm going to set it again, 192, just to get a nice flat gray color that's about the same color as the nodes in my network. I'm then again going to change the style. Instead of a 2-pixel, I'm going to actually maybe make it a 3-pixel style just to, again, see what it looks like. I can adjust it if I need to, but I'll go with this. And then the fill, instead of this red color, I'm going to select 255 to change it to white. Okay, so that's going to be the kind of circle that I'm actually going to want to draw. So now that I've got the settings right, I can go back into the selection tool and then just delete this particular circle because I want to actually start making circles for real now. A couple of options for the circle tool. To make it an even circle, you actually click and hold the control key while you're drawing the circle, and that will actually align it to the page grid and make sure it's an even circle rather than an oval. You could also use the shift key to, well, let me just show you that control. So I've clicked and hold the control key. Again, when you're sort of aligning it, it'll align it to the page grid. So if you click and drag, it will be a nice even circle most of the time, so you can actually get it to an even circle to the number of squares of the size that you want it to be. So this is about 5 squares, and so this is going to be the largest. Is that 5 squares? No, that's 1 square too many. Try that again. There we go. That's about 5 squares, so that will be the largest circle in this particular set. I'm going to then create a couple of additional circles for different sizes, so I've got different sizes represented in my legend here. I'm going to actually draw them inside this circle that I already created just to save room. You could also create other circles underneath it. Depends on how you want to actually align this. So I'm going to then click in, do maybe a 3-square circle. I actually think I've still got this too large. Yeah, I still have it too large. All right, start over again. There's 5. Create one that's 3, and then create one that is 1. And again, I'm using that control key to actually align those and make sure that they're all correct. And again, with my snapping, it will automatically snap the alignment to this page grid, so it goes directly to the page grid. If that's not happening for you, you want to change some of the snapping options over here on the right. Make sure you've got snap the cusp nodes, have that selected. Make sure that's selected, and then when you try it again, it should go ahead and snap to those borders. Again, you also want to have the snap to grid down here in the lower right selected. Just make sure those are selected so that the snapping actually works properly. So that's going to have, actually that didn't, the smallest one didn't quite work. So let's do this again. There we go. Okay, so that's going to be the basis for my legend. So now I'm going to go ahead and add some text around it to just actually add the text labels. So to do that, I'm going to go down here to the lower left and click on the text tool. And then just click in, and again, it should snap directly to the page grid so that you can actually get it to align properly. You'll also want to select this Snap Text Anchor button just to make sure that again, the text aligns to those page grids. And then just click in and start typing some text. So that's probably too small in terms of the text size than what we would want for this particular image. So again, up in the upper left, in the upper toolbar here, we can change the font, we can change the font style, the size, all kinds of additional things like that. So I'm just going to change the font size, maybe make it 24. That looks good. So we'll just go with that. And just edit that a little bit so that I can actually spell properly. Good. Okay. And so now we're going to add the actual labels for the individual sizes the same way. One weird quirk about Inkscape is sometimes if you make changes to the text and then you try and click in and add additional text, it doesn't actually save those changes. So it went back to that 16-point font. So in this case, what we need to do is we need to bump that up to 24, create a new text object, and now when we create new text objects, it will keep that 24-point font so we can actually use stuff from there. So we can do, click in here, say 94 is going to be the largest. I'm just going to add another one. I'm going to figure out what that 3 square circle is going to represent. Create another one for what the smallest one's going to represent, and I'll go in from there. So now again, we can zoom in a little bit. We can figure out how big this is versus this middle circle is, and then we can find the person that actually corresponds to that number of publications. So we can see that in this particular 3 square circle has a width of 63 and a height of 63. So again, when you've got the tool selected, you've got the width and height all available to you, so you know what you're looking for. So we can also double check the largest one. So this is 103 by 103. So we can actually go in here and select this particular person to just double check and make sure that the sizes are the same. To do that though, when we actually select, use the selection tool to select it, it's actually going to select the entire group of those circles. So it's not actually giving you the individual circle, it's giving you all of them. To do that, to actually get to an individual one, you actually want to go down here to this Edit Paths by Node tool, which is directly underneath the selection tool, and that will actually allow you to directly select individual pieces within this visualization. So I can actually then, with that selected, you can see that there's a circle that outlines, that sort of shows you what you're actually going to select. So I can select it here. So now it will, again, bring up the fill. Then if I go with that selected, I can go back up to the selection tool, and it will tell me that this particular node is 101 by 101. That's close enough to 103 by 103, so we're going to go for that largest circle. We know that that's correct. We can go from there. So we're now going to find a node that's about 63 by 63. I'm just going to start, again, using that edit pass by node to start clicking around and finding a circle that corresponds. So this one's 73. Look what Smith is 60 by 60, so that's very, very close to what I'm looking for. So I'm going to then use this Smith D to go back to my node list and find where that person is. So in this case, Smith D has 53 publications. It's again a little bit larger than what I want, so then I'm going to look for this Miller MA, and that's probably the size that's correct for what I'm looking for. So I'm going to go in here, find that Miller MA, select, that's actually 57, whereas Smith D is about 60. So actually 60 is a little bit small, so I actually need to go a little bit higher than Smith. So let's look at Greenfell. Greenfell. That's 72. Okay, so I'll probably then just say that that corresponds to that Smith D. So that will be the middle version. Here, that will be 53. If I really wanted to, I could go in here and adjust the size just to make it a little bit smaller. But for the purposes of most of this, that's close enough. Visually, it's going to be very, very difficult to distinguish. So I'm just going to go with that. So that's going to be 53. So again, I can select the text tool, edit in here, change the actual text value, and go with that. And then I can, again, add a text value for the number of publications. I'm just going to make something up, 12, just for the interest of time. I'm just going to move on. I would then go ahead and find somebody with this version, see what size it is, and then add the size from there. So that gets my publications legend done. Now I'm going to go in and do basically the same thing to add the legend for the individual co-authorships for the lines. So again, I'm just going to, actually one of the things that I do to actually save myself a little bit of time is I'll go ahead and select all three of these and just duplicate it and to just drag it over so that it's got the same size. So to select multiple things, you can again either click and hold and drag to select all of the things within that particular box, or you can hold the Shift key to click on additional things. So Shift and select to select multiple things rather than Control and select. So with all of these selected, I'm just going to do Control D. So Control D will actually just duplicate all of the things that are currently selected. So now when I click and hold and drag to actually move them around, you can see I've now got a new set of things to work with. So I can just change the text in here, and so instead of publications, change this to co-authored works. Again, I'm going to change these because I'm going to change the values, and I'm going to look up what the values are a little bit later on. Adjust this to be about where I want it. I'm actually going to call this, instead of co-authored works, I'm going to call this co-authorships. And so this will then, and then again, I can get this aligned properly. And again, when you've got that snapping feature, it will go ahead and snap it to the page grid so that it's aligned with the other things that you've got. So to create the actual lines, again, you could use the selection tool and just duplicate things. Or again, the way that I tend to work is I'll use this Draw Bezier Curves and Straight Lines tool. So I'll select that. and it will allow me to draw lines within this page grid. So I'll click once to start the line, and then double click to end the line. Again, I will single click to start the line, and then double click to end it, single click, double click. We can adjust the alignment a little bit later on, but I just want to get the lines in there so that I can start working with it. Then again, to actually get the values correctly, I'm going to go ahead and bring up the edge list, look up the edges, and then create the labels from there. So I'll open up the edge list. I will sort it by number of co-authored works, largest to smallest. And so the highest value is going to be 37, and the lowest value is going to be 2, because again, I only kept co-authorships of at least 2 or more papers, so the smallest line here is going to be 2. So it's going to range from 37 to 2. So I can go back in, select the text tool, and then change these values. So it goes from 37, smallest value is going to be 2, and then we can just pick a value that's somewhere halfway in between there. So maybe we'll call it 16 as the middle value, so we can look up what that is. So the largest value is going to be 37. We need to actually look up who that's between, so we'll go back to our edge lists. And what is somewhat inconvenient is the source and target nodes are the node IDs rather than individual people. So you actually have to look up who those people are in the node list to be able to actually see who those, what that line actually refers to. So in this case, the line is between N743, who is Vibud C, and N396, who is Simonson. So that's this line here. So again, we can actually use this edit paths by nodes to select that edge directly. So I'm going to zoom in a whole lot here so I can actually get to the particular line that I'm interested in, use that edit paths by nodes tool to select it, and then click on the particular line that I'm interested in. With that selected, I can go over here to the fill and stroke box to actually see what the actual color is and what the line size is. So in this case, that's 18.5. And this paint is 039.112. So I can go back up here to my label, click on that. Stroke size is going to be 18.5. And the paint is going to be 039.112. So that's going to correspond to that largest line in my graphic. And again, I can do the same thing with some of these other lines. So if I'm looking for this line for 16, I can go into my edge list, find out which 2 authors have 16 co-authored works, 564 to 700. Go over to my node list, and then I can either sort of zoom and sort of scan here, or I can actually do a search. So 700 is Rimbaud, and 564 is this Lenny person. I'm going to zoom out, and I'm going to find that line. Here we go. Click on the selection tool, and then click on the individual page, and that will bring up the stroke paint and the stroke style. Sometimes I find it helpful with some of this to actually create a little Word document where I sort of keep some of these values while I'm working with them. So I might bring up just Notepad++, I can say weight 16, width is, in this case, width is 8, and then color is 71, 144, 230. So I don't actually have to remember it. I can just refer to the notes here. I can go back up here, select the particular line, and then add in 74, 144, 230. And then the stroke style is going to be 8. The width is going to be 8. So again, I can do that same thing with the final line in order to get my legend the way that I want it. So once I have all of that, I can again kind of zoom out, get the positioning the way that I want it. So maybe there's a little bit too much space between these, so I'm going to reduce the space a little bit. Then I'm going to select the whole thing, put it down in the lower right where it's expecting to look for it. And again, we can be as exact as we want to get the borders right, then zoom out to get the final image the way that we want it. There are some other things that we can also do in here. While we're at it, we can also adjust some of the labels if we wanted to, some other things like that. One final thing that I am going to do is I'm going to just tweak the node labels slightly. So you'll notice that the node labels are a bit off-center for a lot of these. They're a bit too far down. This tends to happen more in these individual co-authorship networks. I'm not really sure why, but it does. So I'm going to go to the selection tool, and I'm going to try and just select the labels. So remember, there are 3 different layers here. There's one for the labels, there's one for the nodes, and one for the edges. So I'm just going to try and select the node labels. So sometimes it's actually easier to just zoom way in and click on the side here to try and select one of these node labels. And then with it selected, let's try this again. There we go. Then with it selected, you can actually use the arrow keys to adjust the position. So I can use the arrow key up to just bump that legend up a little bit. It's maybe a little too far. So maybe just 1 up, and then go from there. I can again adjust individual labels by using this selection feature and select just that particular label, go back to the selection tool, and now when you use the arrow, you can sort of bump that up a little bit to make it actually centered and go from there. So again, I can sort of tweak a lot of where these labels are just by sort of clicking in and adjusting them as needed. I can go through that. I can change any one of these labels if I really wanted to. So I can select on the edit text option. I can actually click in here. If I wanted to uppercase this, if I wanted to, I can just type in directly, change it from there, do any additional tweaks that I needed to make, and go from there. So again, I'm going to go ahead and save my changes. And the final thing that I'm going to do once I have all of this done is to go ahead and export the final visualization to a PNG image that I can actually put into a document. So once I've made all my changes, I can again just turn the page grid off by selecting View Page Grid, and then doing File, Export PNG Image. That's how you actually bring up this dialog box. I will also mention, though, that we can also save as other kinds of file types. So if we wanted to save it to something other than a PNG, we could do that too. But for the moment, we'll just select that Export PNG image, and that will bring up this box. So in the box, you want to change a couple of things. You want to change it from the export area, from the drawing to the individual page. So for some reason, it will default to the drawing, which will just have the actual set of images rather than the entire page size. So we want to have a little bit of buffer between the image and the page size, so select page. And then we can change the image size or the resolution of the final image that we want. Inkscape typically defaults to 96 dots per inch as the default DPI setting. I typically go a little bit higher than that. I actually make it double that just because I want a very high resolution PNG image to be able to work with. It's up to you depending on how large size you want. That will actually end up in this case as being a 5200 by 3600. That may be actually a little bit too excessive. So I may actually drop this back down to 96 DPI. And so it will automatically readjust the size to make it what I want. I can click on this Export As button to change any of the file settings or the location that I want to export it to, or I can just go ahead and click on Export to create that final image. So it will go ahead and export that to a PNG image that I can look at in here. So that will be the final image graphic that I end up putting into my final visualization. So this is what I would actually put into any report or presentation or anything like that that I would actually give to a customer. As I mentioned, you can change other types of file formats. So if you go up to File and then Save As, you can save it as a variety of other vector graphic file formats. So if you wanted to save this directly to a PDF document, for instance, you could save it directly to a PDF and then have it in that PDF vector graphic format that you could zoom into for whatever purposes you wanted to. You can also save it to an encapsulated PostScript file, which again, a lot of the journal editors will prefer for publication. So you can save it directly to that EPS file and then have it in a file format that you can put into a publication. You will notice, though, that you cannot save it to a JPEG or a TIFF directly from Inkscape. That is one of the limitations of this particular software tool. So if you're working with a journal that prefers TIFF images, you have to export it to a PDF version first and then export from PDF to TIFF after that. So there's a bit of a sort of a workaround to actually get it into those file formats. So that's why we tend to prefer working with EPS file formats rather than TIFF. But if you have to go that route, you can again just save it to a PDF and then save to a TIFF to get into that very high resolution bitmap image. So again, there are some other things that we do to tweak this, but for the purposes of this particular presentation, that was about all I wanted to cover today. So we've now taken you from the raw.isi file all the way through to creating the image, or creating the network, creating the image in Gephi, and then saving the final image in Inkscape into something that we can actually put into a document and work with in a final presentation. So next week, in the next course, we'll actually sort of review some of these steps in the context of network analysis for topic analysis. So we'll be talking more about how to actually use some of these procedures to look at the topics of a set of publications that you happen to be working with.